yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the goal to permanently extend the research and development tax credit. Our businesses, large and small, they need that certainty. They can't be trying to make budgetary decisions in order to help grow the economy, create jobs on these short-term measures that have been coming through Congress. What I have an objection to this evening, and where the problem lies with this legislation before us today, is none of it's paid for. You know, we've been to this dance before. We know what works and what doesn't work when it comes to the fiscal management of our nation. What works is pay-as-you-go budgeting rules. That there's going to be a revenue reduction or a spending increase, you have to find an offset in the budget to pay for it, to maintain balance. We had that system in place during the 1990s, thanks to the budget agreement of 1990 that President George H.W. Bush signed into law, and then followed by the budget agreement of 1993 when President Clinton was in office. And subsequently, with the strength of a vibrant, growing economy where 24 million private sector jobs were created, along with pay-as-you-go budgeting rules that were in place, President Clinton saw 4 years of budget surpluses at the end of his term, where we were paying down the national debt rather than adding to it. And thank God we were at that time, because when September 11th hit, that unexpected disaster against our nation, we had financial resources in which to respond. But after my Republican colleagues took complete control of the federal government during the 2000s, with President Bush's election, they reverted back to bad habits, with 2 large taxes that weren't paid for, 2 major wars that weren't paid for, the passage of a new prescription drug bill, the largest expansion of entitlement spending since Medicare was created in '65 and not a nickel of it paid for, the largest increase in discretionary spending since the Great Society, none of it paid for. So when President Obama took office, he inherited a $1.5 trillion budget deficit in his first year. And they have not been shy in laying the blame of fiscal mismanagement and the structural annual budget deficits at the current president's doorstep. And yet this is exactly what gets us into this spot. Now, the policy behind the permanent extension, you're not going to hear much dispute or much debate about that. This is all about who's going to be fiscally responsible and do the hard work of trying to find offsets in the budget to do it the right way. So we're not leaving a legacy of debt to our children. So we're not continuing to borrow from China. And we could go back over the last 4 years and repeat the same statements that we've heard from my Republican friends about the need for fiscal management and tough decisions in budgeting. But what's perhaps the height of cynicism this evening is just a few short weeks after they passed the Republican Ryan budget resolution, they're violating it here tonight. It called for offsets for any permanent extension in the tax code. That's not what we're doing here. But what's really disheartening is there is a plan B. To Chairman Camp's credit, a few weeks ago, he released a comprehensive tax reform draft discussion in order to simplify the code, make us more competitive, broaden the base and lower the rates, but he paid for it through some tough decisions with expenditures that don't make sense to help us be competitive in the 21st century. We can go back to that proposal and look for some of the items that Chairman Camp himself was proposing as a way to pay for this permanent extension tonight. President Obama, this year in the budget he submitted, had items of pay-fors within the tax code that we could scrub because there is overlap between the two. But really what this comes down to is who's serious about doing the tough stuff, and that's finding offsets in order to do the good policy that we're missing here this evening. Yes, we should be finding a way to permanently extend the R&D credit. Our businesses, large and small, need that certainty. My name's on this bill, but I was always under the proviso that we'd be fiscally responsible in moving forward and not leave this legacy for future generations. I also think we ought to be doing a permanent 179 expensing for our small businesses and family farmers. It's another expensive item. But there are areas in the tax code we can look to in order to find offsets to pay for it, which I also think is important for economic job creation and the growth we need in this nation. $17 trillion in debt, and people are wondering who's to blame. Well, you can look this evening at a bill before us today that calls for $156 billion over the next 10 years, not a nickel of it paid for. We can do better. We have to do better for our children and for future generations. The clock is ticking. on all of this. We don't have this luxury of delaying the tough decisions anymore. And there are other avenues that we can take, and I'm confident if we were to sit down and talk to each other, we could find some common ground and bipartisan agreement of what would be acceptable offsets in the revenue code in order to do this permanent extension here tonight. But that requires a little more effort, and that requires, God forbid, having to say no to some constituent and powerful special interest groups in this town from time to time. You know, the easiest thing in the world is to offer a tax cut without paying for it. Who doesn't want a tax relief? That's not difficult, but it's also not the tough budget decisions that they were talking about just a few weeks ago on the floor when you were passing the Ryan Republican budget resolution. But if you go back and look at it again, to its credit, it called for offsets for permanent extensions. So what is true here? Are they true and committed to fiscal responsibility that's called for in that budget resolution? Or is that all just a numbers game to make the numbers add up? And the first opportunity they have to violate that resolution, they're going to do so tonight with an unpaid-for permanent extension, and that's just $156 billion in the first 10 years. This will be a gift that keeps giving if we don't find offsets in the future. So I'd encourage my colleagues to think hard and long about this, because this is just the first of 6 tax extenders that will inevitably be coming up. And I hope this isn't the pattern we're going to be seeing with the 5 additional ones where they're going to come forward without any pay-fors. Let's load up the debt, and let's claim that the economy is going to grow and everything is going to be fine afterwards. We know that hasn't worked in the past. It's not going to work tonight. I encourage my colleagues, let's vote no. We've got time. And we can work with the Senate, and we can work with what Chairman Camp was proposing and what the administration was proposing in their budget, and find the appropriate offsets, do the responsible thing, and let's end this legacy of deficit financing and give our children the hope and opportunity that they deserve. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr.